الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين وبعد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tests and He blesses. And sometimes that which is perceived by us to be a test is in fact a blessing. And so for our brothers and sisters in Turkey and in Syria, we have to look at the test that they are going through as a blessing of sorts that bi'idhnillah they will come to appreciate and realize on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And sometimes in these situations, the one who's actually being tested is not the one who is being afflicted, but the one who is onlooking the affliction, the one who is watching the affliction taking place, and whether or not the person who is watching the affliction taking place comes to the aid of the afflicted. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it a means of expiation for them in the next life, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless those who have passed away in this earthquake, this calamity, with paradise. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant patience to those who have remained behind them. The topic of this afternoon's khutbah is one which is more relevant perhaps to our community and us as Muslims in the UK, in Europe, and perhaps in America, etc., in the Western world, so as to say. And it's befitting that prior to the khutbah, prior to Jum'ah, again we witnessed another young person coming to Islam. And we are witnessing now, weekly, sometimes even daily, new Muslims in our community, in Lewisham, here alone, only in Lewisham. We are witnessing weekly new Muslims, sometimes daily. But if we look nationally, then perhaps we can make the claim, though of course it would require research, perhaps we can make the claim that daily there are new Muslims. Daily there are new Muslims. And that is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this afternoon, I wanted to quickly look at the way of the Prophet ﷺ when it came to Islam and da'wah, and the way he would treat new Muslims. As it's becoming a topic which is relevant to us as a community, it's important that we understand the methodology of the Prophet ﷺ with new Muslims as they come to our community. And the first point to start with is, of course, that the Prophet ﷺ, he was sent rahmatan lil alameen, as a mercy for mankind, a mercy for mankind. Rahmatan lil alameen. He was sent to all. He was not only sent to the Arabs, nor was he only sent to the Africans or to the Asians, nor was he sent only to the Europeans, etc., etc. He was not sent to the black or the white, the yellow or the red. He was sent to mankind, regardless of color, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of nationality. Likewise, he was sent to both man and woman. He was not sent to men alone. Likewise, he was not sent to women alone. And he did not come to give preference to men over women or women over men. Rahmatan lil alameen, sent to all of mankind as a mercy. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us the state of the Prophet ﷺ emotionally when it came to the importance of calling mankind to Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَى آثَارِهِمْ إِن لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ أَسَفًا. And At-Tabari, he basically explains, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to the Prophet ﷺ, it's as if you are going to destroy yourself, in fact kill yourself, due to the grief and the sadness that overcomes you with your people not accepting Islam. This was something that affected the Prophet ﷺ deeply. The Prophet ﷺ was emotionally attached to bringing people to Islam. That was his purpose, of course. And so the question that we should ask ourselves is, as a collective, is that a part of our purpose? And we have perhaps a consequence of secularization and the secular society that we live in. We separate between our purpose as Muslims and our everyday living. And we expect sometimes that it's the role and the job and the position of the masajid and the imams and those who work in the masajid to bring people to Islam and to teach and so on and so forth. Alhamdulillah, in our community, it's the community that brings people to Islam. But I'm talking about generally. We believe that we should give our money to the masajid and the masajid should do everything else. And if you look to the Sahaba, as we will see, there were some whom the Prophet ﷺ used and utilized to teach. Others for calling. Others for spending. Others for fighting. The Prophet ﷺ, he was able to identify where a person can be used and he would use them. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, was the best in all things and he was the best of man managers. He managed the Sahaba in accordance to the ability and perhaps the talents of the Sahaba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again, when informing us about the state of the Prophet ﷺ, when it came to his message, calling others to Islam, surely there has come to you from your midst a messenger who feels it very hard on him if you face a hardship. When the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ suffered, the Prophet ﷺ suffered with them. When the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, or I should say, with the Ummah going to suffer after the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ suffered. As we know the famous hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ was crying, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Jibreel to him. And Jibreel asked him, what's the issue, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, Ummati, Ummati. He was crying over the state of his Ummah to come, etc. And I'm not going to go into that hadith right now, it's not the point. But the point is, the Prophet ﷺ, his heart was attached to the state of his Ummah. And more so, their guidance, or lack of guidance. That was the main concern of the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that He was very anxious for our welfare. And for the believers, He is very kind and very merciful. The Prophet ﷺ would extend his kindness and his mercy to Muslims and likewise to non-Muslims. Why? In order to bring them to Islam. In order to bring them to Islam. That was his purpose. That was what drove him in his everyday actions. Guidance. Whether he was leading, whether he was teaching, whether he was being a companion amongst his companions, etc., whether it was in the battlefield, wherever the Prophet ﷺ was found, that which drove him was guidance. Guidance. And Al-Hasan, or Abu al-Hasan ibn Battal, he says, commenting on Sahih Muslim, that he used to call people to Islam individually and collectively. Individually and collectively. And had a keen desire and interest in the guidance of man, just as we were saying. And this is something important to note. The Prophet ﷺ would call individuals and groups. He would be calling individuals and groups, collective. There are times where the Prophet ﷺ called entire tribes to Islam. And there are times where the Prophet ﷺ called individuals to Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ's da'wah, his call to Islam, was not only those who were oppressed or impoverished. No, the Prophet ﷺ would call the oppressed, and he would call the impoverished, and he would likewise call the wealthy. He would likewise call the kings and the rulers, those whom at the time could perhaps be labeled as the oppressors. The Prophet ﷺ, he sent letters to the kings of the Romans and the Persians and the African nations at the time, etc. The Prophet ﷺ, his da'wah was for all. And the Prophet ﷺ did not specify a particular group alone for da'wah. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ was busy calling the heads of Quraysh to Islam. Even though at the time the heads of Quraysh were the ones who were harming the Sahaba. And the Prophet ﷺ accepted from the heads of Quraysh Islam after he had defeated them in battle, of course. But even though they had harmed the Sahaba and they had harmed him ﷺ himself, and they had in fact killed some of his family members, the Prophet ﷺ called them to Islam, and when they accepted, due to defeat, he accepted their Islam. The Prophet ﷺ's main goal was da'wah. Da'wah. Nothing else. The Prophet ﷺ had no care for vengeance on a personal level. Nor was he neglectful, nor did he decide that some would not become Muslim and others. No, he called all. And so the question we have to ask as a collective, are we engaged in calling others to Islam? As a collective. For example, in the workplace, do I call those who I work with to Islam? And most of the time, a person is in between one of two. He's either a da'iyah or he's a mad'u. Either you're calling or you're being called to something. You're one of the two. If you pray in front of people that do not pray, without speaking, you're calling them to pray. But if you do not pray in front of people that also don't pray, likewise, you're calling them to leave off the prayer. Or they're calling you to leave off the prayer. My work colleagues, am I calling them to Islam by showing them what Islam is? For the young brothers and sisters, with your friends, do you speak to them about Islam? Do you tell them what Islam is? Do you put it on them and say, why haven't you become a Muslim yet? If not, then why not? If we saw our friends running to a pit of fire, a real pit of fire in this life, they're running and I can see clearly there's a pit of fire in front of my friend, would I not shout out and scream and tell him, you're running towards fire? Can you not see? Are you blind? Likewise, if they have no Islam, am I not leaving them to run towards a pit of fire, an eternal pit of fire? If I have relatives that are not Muslim, why am I not calling them to Islam? And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to have hikmah. So a person should judge the situation. I'm not saying we should go out and start shouting, fire, fire. No, of course not. With hikmah, with wisdom. But it should be my intention. Perhaps it starts by buying them a gift, by changing my character. I have the intention, I want this person to become a Muslim. And that is what determines the way I treat this person. I don't interact with this person in a good way because they treat me in a good way. Nor do I interact with this person in a bad way because they treat me in a bad way. No, I interact with this person as a good person. Why? Because I want guidance for them regardless how they treat me. And of course, at times, to discipline a person is good behavior. So I'm not saying that if a person is bullying us, we should simply be kind and smile. No, not at all. but da'wah should be that which drives me. And I should realize I am here in the UK, in Europe, in the Western world for one purpose only, which is to call others to Islam. If I'm not, then I'm not serving my purpose. I'm not here to be comfortable. I'm not here to be comfortable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't create me to seek comfort. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't create me to seek out a nice house or drive a nice car. That's not my purpose here. My purpose here is to establish that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and more specifically, whilst I am here alive in any non-Muslim country, my purpose is, firstly and foremostly, or should be, to call others to Islam. And as has been mentioned previously, the Sahaba would have died to be in the position that we are in. In fact, the Sahaba, some of them did die to try to be in the positions that we're in, reaching far off lands from where Islam started so that they can bring Islam to the people. We're here, and not only are we here, but we are here as a part of the people themselves. We are here as a part of the people themselves. We can have intimate discussions, and we can show them from the inside out what Islam is. Are we utilizing that chance, that opportunity? Are we utilizing it? If not, how can we start? The Prophet ﷺ, how did he treat those who became Muslim? Number one, he would teach them. When someone became Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ would teach them. عن أبي مالك الأشعري عن أبيه قال كان الرجل إذا أسلم علمه النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام الصلاة ثم أمره أن يدعو بهؤلاء الكلمات اللهم اغفر لي وارحمني واهدني وعافني وارزقني. An example, one of the companions, he narrates, when a person would become Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ would teach him how to pray. And perhaps the Prophet ﷺ would not teach him himself all the time, but he would assign someone to teach him. And then he would teach him some dua, some adhkar. And there are instances where the Prophet ﷺ, he would not teach a person more than the wajibat. Some of the A'rab, for example, those who came from the desert, the nomadic peoples, the Prophet ﷺ would teach them the salah, teach them siyam, teach them zakah, and that's it. And there are others, the Prophet ﷺ would send groups. For example, Banu Hayyan, the Prophet ﷺ, he sent some of the Sahaba to go and live with them and teach them. And there are other examples where the Prophet ﷺ, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, the Prophet ﷺ, he sent him to Yemen to call people to Islam firstly. And what did the Prophet ﷺ say? فَإِنْهُمْ أَطَاعُوكَ لِذَلِكَ. If they accept Islam, then what? Teach them as-salah. If they establish the prayer, teach them as-zakah. If they give from charity, etc., etc. And so slowly but surely, the Sahaba would build up those who became new Sahaba, new companions of the Prophet ﷺ, new Muslims. And this became the sunnah and the practice of the Sahaba that took over after the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali. In fact, some of these cities in Iraq today, they were built and established so that the Sahaba could go and live in Iraq and teach the Muslims, teach the new Muslims. And that's why you find one of the most prominent schools of fiqh, the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, came from Iraq. Why? Because of the vast amount of Sahaba that moved there and that were teaching. And from them, of course, Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu ta'ala, who became the Khalifa, the last of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, who moved to Iraq himself. Likewise, in Medina, you find that the Sahaba would teach the new Muslims, etc. And this continued after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's why we have chains. Some of the great ulama of Islam, they were not even born as Muslims. They were not born as Muslims. Some of the great ulama of Islam. Ibn Sirin, very famous, very well known. His father became a Muslim. His father became a Muslim. Yet Ibn Sirin became one of the well-established ulama of his time. And so the first thing is to teach. The second thing is to focus on that which would keep them steadfast. To keep them steadfast and keep them away from things that may push them away from Islam. And a very clear example of this we can find. Aisha radiallahu anha began to question the Prophet ﷺ about aspects of the Kaaba. About aspects of the Kaaba, is this included? Is that included? Etc. etc. And in brief, the Prophet ﷺ, he said to her, "Oh Aisha, if your people were not so close to the days of Jahiliyyah, i.e. if they were not new Muslims, I would have had the Kaaba rebuilt according to the blueprint of Ibrahim alayhi salam." And this is a matter of Qibla. The first house to be built by man, and some say the angels built it before Ibrahim alayhi salam, and Ibrahim rebuilt it. But the point being, the first house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the direction with which, that we follow when we pray, the Prophet ﷺ is saying it's not in accordance to its original blueprint, it's slightly off, but it's not going to be rebuilt. Why? Because it will cause a problem for the new Muslims. They're too new to understand this. And so if that's the case with something which is from the signs of Islam, the Kaaba, when everyone sees the Kaaba, they know Islam. This is the direction the Muslims face, etc. If that's the Qibla, what about theological issues? Theological issues that have no practical relevance to the everyday Muslim, let alone the new Muslim. What about issues of khilaf? It's not wise and it's not befitting to teach a new Muslim the differences of opinion in Islamic theology, in Islamic law, in fiqh. If you see a new Muslim placing his hands in a particular place and you go and say, no, place them here, place them there. Don't raise your hands, do raise your hands. Irrelevant, making it confusing and difficult for the person. Let the person establish the salah, the silab between himself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that connection. Likewise, aqeedah. All the Muslim and new Muslim needs to know initially is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, the Prophet ﷺ is the final and last messenger, the angels exist, hellfire and paradise exist, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree exists, the books exist, and the Quran is the abrogator of all books, etc. etc. The basic pillars of Iman. They don't need to know anything more than this. And if I go to them and I try to teach them complicated issues, I am making it difficult for them. If I go to a new Muslim and I start to say to them, don't go to this masjid, don't go to that masjid, don't speak to this person, don't listen to that person, what am I doing? I'm making something which is simple, difficult and complicated. And so I am going against the way of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ would teach them that which is most important to them. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ would even allow some of the new Muslims to leave off certain acts of worship. For example, we have instances where a person came to the Prophet ﷺ, as narrated by Anas ibn Malik, and he asked if he could become a Muslim and not pray 5 times, only pray 2 times. And the Prophet, Nasir ibn Asim narrated it. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed for it. The person said, I can't pray 5 times, I can pray 2. The Prophet ﷺ said, okay, become Muslim. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ understood, of course he understood, that this person eventually is going to do what? Pray 5 times a day. Once the Iman becomes deep-rooted in the heart, the person will pray 5 times a day, of course. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ, Anas ibn Malik, he narrates, someone came to him and said, or the Prophet ﷺ said to him, Aslim, become a Muslim. And he said, I find in myself some difficulty. There's some dislike I have for it. And the Prophet ﷺ said, become a Muslim even if you feel in yourself dislike. Why would the Prophet ﷺ say such a thing? Because he knows that once the Iman becomes deep-rooted in the heart, of course the person will find no dislike for Islam. And so having an understanding of a person's situation, it's important. An example which is perhaps more relevant to our context. A new Muslim comes to the masjid, or a person who wants to become Muslim comes to the masjid, and he's not wearing a thobe, or he's not wearing trousers which are befitting. Maybe he's wearing tight clothes. Maybe he's wearing shorts and his thighs are revealed. Leave the person be. Let the person wear what they're wearing. Perhaps they come to the masjid and they're wearing something which is not befitting. Maybe they have a hairstyle or a color in their hair that's not befitting. Let them be. Let them become Muslim first. these issues are not even secondary issues. The most important thing is Islam. And we can even go further than that. And let's say if a person goes to a mosque and the mosque does have established issues that are problematic in the framework of Islamic theology. Let's say the masjid does have some issues. That's better for them than disbelief. It's better that a person becomes a Muslim with some issues in theology than remains upon disbelief. It's better that a person practices Islam with some problems in the theory of Islam than doesn't practice at all. We have to understand the context that we're living in. We have to understand the situation that we find ourselves in. And if we look to the Prophet ﷺ, we will find the best of guidance. The Prophet ﷺ did not treat new Muslims the way that he would treat Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhum. In fact, he didn't treat most of the Sahaba the way he would treat Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. Why? Because they were different. Abu Bakr, Umar, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, I want to give half of my wealth in Sadaqah. The Prophet ﷺ accepted from him. And we know, he thought on that day I've beaten Abu Bakr because they would compete in worship. Abu Bakr, radiallahu anh, he gave all of his wealth. And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, what have you left for your family? And he said, I've left for them Allah and His Messenger. He said, I have left for them Allah and His Messenger. Yet we find in another hadith, someone came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, I want to give half of my wealth in Sadaqah. And he said, that's too much. Or in fact, if I'm not mistaken, he said all of it. And he said, that's too much. He said half. He said, that's too much. He said a third. He said a third. And a third is too much. The Prophet ﷺ allowed him to give a third of his wealth in Sadaqah. But he said, a third is too much for you to give. But give it. A clear difference in the way the Prophet ﷺ treated Abu Bakr and Umar and this individual, this Sahabi. And so we have to likewise open our eyes and understand as a community, not as individuals, but as a community, as a wider community, that when we deal with people, we cannot deal with each and every person the same. We are at different levels. And we have to look to a non-Muslim and bring him firstly and foremostly to Islam. And then we can build on the Iman. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. The Prophet ﷺ, his main mission, his main purpose, and that which became the main mission and purpose of those who followed him, his companions, and those who followed the companions, the tabi'een, and those who were successful throughout the history of Islam, the main mission was establishment of Iman upon this earth. And the establishment of Iman took different shades. At times, the establishment of Iman was simply calling people. And at other times, the establishment of Iman was building. And at times, the establishment of Iman was defending, etc., etc. And so we have to look at our time and try to understand where we are and try to adopt the methodology of the Prophet ﷺ and become a collective who call people to Islam. Right now, the Muslims make up roughly 6-point-something% of the UK, 6-point-something%, roughly. But the reality is, if we as individuals and as a collective were to take upon ourselves the mission of the Prophet ﷺ in calling others to Islam, that number would grow so quick and so fast because Islam is the truth. And people now are looking for the truth. People are looking for the truth and people are lost. And when you're in the dark and a person comes to you with light, you don't turn the light away. You grab on. And that's where people are right now. The problem, I believe, and Allahu A'lam, is not that people don't want to accept Islam, it's that we're not taking Islam to them. Why? Because as a community, and again, I'm not speaking about our community alone. I'm not suggesting individuals. But as a community, we have become more concerned with our own comforts and our own positions in this life than we have with the guidance of others and the mission of the Prophet ﷺ. And so if we were to reflect and introspect and change, perhaps we can be a generation that bring Islam to the UK, to Europe, in a way that hasn't been seen before. Why not? No one would have predicted that the companions would take Islam to the Romans and to the Persians and to the entire northern African or the region of Africa which is above the Sahara, and then the sub-Saharan regions of Africa. No one predicted that would happen. But the Sahaba did it. Why? Because of the winds of Iman which took a grip of their hearts. And so if we were to follow the way of the Sahaba, perhaps we can follow in their way and we can make changes such as the changes that they made. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purify our hearts and grant us the ability to follow in the way of His Prophet and the way of the Sahaba. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين اللهم استخدمنا ولا تستبدلنا إنك مجيب دعوات اللهم كن في عون إخواننا وأخواتنا في سوريا وفي تركيا يا رب العالمين اللهم تقبل منهم شهداءهم واعف عنهم واغفر لهم اللهم أنزل عليهم الصبر وارزقهم من رزقك يا رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة. Maybe.